everyone. Today we have James back on, and we also have Nano Scholar with us. Nano Scholar is a software engineer by trade, but the way I know him is that we actually attended university together, 8, 9 years ago, long time ago now. And he was a pivotal part of the creation of the ideas that James and I discussed on the channel last time. DM theory, or data logical metaphysical theory. And one of the reasons that I wanted to get Nano and James together is because I was struck, in my conversations with James last time about the similarities that I could see between his ideas about paradoxism and about nothingness and the importance of paradox and some of Nano's ideas, which he called anti-logic. And I thought that, that there would be some, I guess, fertile ground for a conversation about metaphysics there. And I have a few different, subjects in mind that we could go over, but I was hoping that we could start with maybe, James, maybe you could just explain some of the material we covered last time, because obviously Nano won't be familiar. And then Nano, if you could just, share, I guess, a little bit about anti-logic and maybe a little bit about yourself as well, if you want.
Okay, great. Well, once again, it's nice to meet you, Nano. And yeah, definitely looking forward to working on some of these ideas and seeing if there's any kind of advancements that we can make. That would be great. So basically, my worldview is, well, there's something called metaphysical pluralism, on this idea that there are certain things out there that can contradict each other and that they're still valid. Dialetheism is that idea that some contradictions can be true. Now, I was just schooled by Graham Priest on this. He says that although some contradictions can be true, it doesn't mean that, well, it doesn't tell you which ones are true. The one that I prefer to, or the one that I see as true, is the idea of nothingness or void as being ontologically true. And thanks to InSync, in our very first discussion, you had made the distinction that we have to know when to do an ontological commitment and versus a what was it, more of like a concept. So to make sure that we know that when we're talking about something, that we're actually making sure that it's that it's either like, do you mean it in the sense that it's ontologically real, like physically real, or is it conceptually real? So I believe it's real. See, physical is where things get kind of complicated and paradoxical, but the idea is that nothingness is paradoxical on its face, and that's something to be understood and validated in some way. Now, according to Graham Priest, he has, I believe, proven that logically anyway. So the interface between what's real and what's not real is the main debate that I tend to have with people in this community, because well, it's been an orthodoxy for a long time in the West that the law of non-contradiction cannot be broken, and that it isn't otherwise. And I stand on the other side of the fence on that. So that's just the precursor to my ideas. My ideas are basically a method to arrive at that understanding through experience, because I don't believe absolute truth in a way that is, to achieve the ineffable is something to be experienced. It's not something to be described. As soon as you conceptualize it, it's already an error. And the main idea that I had that launched me into this community was this thing called the Infinity Limited, in which it's a thought exercise that allows you to delineate between your perceptual ability and your conceptual ability to perceive infinity and nothingness. And it's supposed to launch you into this experience of ontological void versus just a description of it. And beyond that, everything that Alex works on, also read all of your papers, Alex, is pretty much, except for this one, we've got some strong light coming in, except for this very one difference that we have on this metaphysical standpoint, whether nothingness is ontological or not. Everything that Alex describes in his ideas, and you too, InSync, to some degree, is basically my worldview. So that kind of gives you a bit of an idea of, without me having to explain too much.
So if you wanted to just, I guess, maybe open with telling us a little bit about yourself, Nano, and your background and stuff, and then talk a bit about anti-logic.
Yeah, that's good.
And yeah, what I guess what you thought of what James described about his approach and
Yeah, I can
we
definitely
can
see
do.
some overlaps between what James is describing and like some of the ideas that I've been exploring and stuff as well. I guess I'll start explaining a bit of myself. So I am, as Instinct said earlier, a software engineer. So I have a lot of interest in computation, sort of like languages and the structure of information or data or things like that. And as part of exploring those interests, I've also spent some time exploring various parts of like metaphysics and philosophy and stuff. And one of the ideas that I ended up spending a lot of time investigating was something that I called anti-logic, which was essentially, I, I, I didn't find it compelling that the laws of logic are like this sort of like thing that must be, and so sort of in trying to critique the laws of logic themselves, I'm like, okay, well, what if I try doing sort of like a proof by contradiction? And so I tried like sort of essentially negating all the three like primary laws of logic. So like sort of A equals A, or a thing is itself, like A is not a thing is not itself. And like same thing with all the laws. So like basically what I found. Oh, is this still there? Okay, yeah, it does. The video dropped for a sec. Yeah, basically after negating all of the laws at the same time, I found that I couldn't actually find a contradiction, and the sort of the idea of what a contradiction is changed as well. And I found that that system where all the three laws are all negated at the same time leads to sort of like an alternative system where it is like completely valid for something to be both true and false simultaneously. Because without the law of excluded middle, that actually becomes like sort of a legal state for logical like propositions and stuff in that system. And so then playing around with it a bit more, I sort of found that a lot of like common like paradoxes, so things like the liar's paradox and stuff, start to actually, instead of being just sort of like this logical contradiction that is nonsense, it actually fits into that system of logic, because it's like, well, is the statement true or false? Well, it's actually both. It sort of just depends on the context surrounding it, and that is like valid. Yeah, I'm not too sure where to go from there. But that's sort of a brief introduction of, I guess, myself and the idea of anti-logic.
Yeah, what came to mind when you said that, with something like the lies paradox, that it's sort of both is I always think of it as sort of like the truth value oscillates. It's kind of true and then it's false and then it's true and then it's false. Like it's kind of always self-negating. But I was curious. You said that as you sort of explored anti-logic, that your idea of what a contradiction was changed. Can you like help me understand what you mean by that?
Well, like previously, I sort of thought of a contradiction as like some kind of statement that can never be true, basically. Like no matter, like if you take like some like pieces, so say like A and say like propositional logic, like you have like A and B, or like you build a proposition, and if no, you can't change any of the axioms to be, there's no like valid state where the statement as a whole can be true. And if all possible states of the different axioms being true or false all lead to it being false, well then that statement is a contradiction, basically. And instead of it sort of my idea of contradictions being something that which can never be true, it sort of shifted to something which is, it sounds like the same thing, but something which is always false, basically. And so with the lies paradox, as you said, it sort of like does this like oscillating thing where if you assume one state, then at the end of it you find the other one. But because it's not always false, it's not actually a contradiction. So there's sort of like, similar to how a tautology is something that is always true, a contradiction is something that is always false. And there's also this middle ground where it can be either or both, sort of like both or neither, I guess. I don't know exactly how to put it into words, but that's sort of the idea.
Okay. And does that, like, what, I guess, what role does that play when it comes to, like, I guess, your conceptualization of reality? Does this like changed perspective on contradiction lead to a view where contradiction is a part of the world or something? Or
I think so, yeah. I think that that I'm it's led me to the point where I'm not even convinced that there is such a thing as absolute truth. Or like that objectivity is like real, I guess. Obviously I don't think that I'm not what's it called when you believe that everything is subjective. I can't remember that. But
relativist, the subjectivist.
So that I would say that it's not an accurate representation of my beliefs, but I also am not convinced that there is some objective thing which exists. And I've even like in the past joked that like referred to the sort of, there's like this aspect of it that I can't describe with language. So there's like the space between true and false. Like there is a clear defined boundary between these two values. And even just in language in general, like we differentiate between different words and see them as like distinct things. But there's no, the boundary we wouldn't say that the boundary actually exists. Like the thing that the boundary is surrounding, we say exists, but the boundary itself doesn't exist, and yet it is able to keep these things distinct. And so I found it very interesting to try and, I guess, understand what that boundary actually is. And the only satisfying conclusion that I came to is that the boundary doesn't actually objectively exist. We just sort of arbitrarily draw boundaries around things so that way we can make sense of them, essentially.
Interesting. I have a question. So, in your estimation, is anti-logic a logic of its own? Is it
Yes.
a pair-consistent logic? Yes. Okay. And what does it mean to use logic in order to try to create or define this anti-logic?
Well, it was just sort of the springboard that led to it. It was exploring what happens when I negate the laws of logic is how I landed exploring that idea. And then I also found that it seems like the regular laws of logic as like a more restricted form can fall out of the thing I've been calling anti-logic. And so I haven't decided conclusively for myself whether I think it is like a distinct thing entirely from regular like classical logic, or if it is sort of like a superset of which classical logic is a piece.
So maybe some of these things that you've discovered, insofar as what happens around contradictions, it should be a matter of moving the goalpost to include those things into regular logic. Or are the two mutually exclusive? Because it seems to me that what defines logic, in the classical sense, is that it is has these boundaries, its limits. But it seems like guys like you and I look at that and think what Hegel said about limits having or implying something beyond them. So, this is fascinating stuff. Do you have more work that I could go and look into that you've written, or?
Not published anyway. I have a bunch of notes scattered around various computers and stuff. I haven't got any of sort of like collected into one place that's publicly accessible.
I have talked with Chris about like potentially helping him consolidate some of this material into an article or an essay or something, expounding the idea, because I think it is of philosophical interest. It's the kind of thing I think other people would definitely find thought-provoking. We just haven't actually got around to doing that yet.
Yeah, well, there would be value in it. I could see that, who knows, maybe we could forge a new kind of paraconsistent logic.
I'd also have a sort of a second type of logic that sort of fell out also of exploring anti-logic, which I was sort of calling bistable logic. And I think of anti-logic existing sort of separate from some kind of temporal dimension. Like it's not, that's why when you say like with the liars paradox, it seems to like oscillate. But if you remove sort of time from that equation, then it just sort of is either both or it's neither or some separate value. Whereas with bistable logic, I was sort of like, well, what if I actually build that sort of time aspect into it? And I started playing around with implementing it in like a system in code for sort of evaluating these expressions. And the way it worked was relatively simple. It's just that whenever one of the axioms in the statement is evaluated, its value would invert. And so as the like program is running, the values each time they're referenced are constantly flipping, and it can lead to some really strange behavior. And I was able to, like, in just a simple like logical proposition, implement a like binary counter. And so each time you evaluated the proposition, the value of the bits or the axioms that are flipping would sort of increment to the next binary number before resetting back to zero. And so it seems like that system could even possibly be capable of performing some kind of computation. But that's sort of separate from anti-logic. I think it's just a separate system of logic again. And that one I call bistable logic.
Stable.
I'm curious, maybe it would help to flesh out the level of overlap between your conceptions. For each of you to talk a little bit about, I guess, how you conceptualize nothingness. I remember there's this great phrase I remember Nano came up with years ago. I don't actually think he believes this anymore based on some of our more recent conversations, but I think it's a really just a very succinct formula, which is there is no not, only not. So, you could think of that as like, falsehood or the denial, right, of something. That's not a real part of existence, only the denial of denial. And obviously, if you have a double positive, you just get a double negative, rather, you just get the positive, which is just, what things are, something like that. So I guess I was, kind of setting the stage a little bit for Nano to elaborate at like how his ideas on that have changed, and what each of you, James and Nano, think about, I guess, the nature of nothingness and the existence or non-existence of falsehood, and how you would, I guess, conceptualize, what we were talking about earlier in terms of the limits of the world, or the limits of our conceptions of the world, implying it's, something beyond, right? And obviously, we have these models of the world and we like to think that they're true. And then beyond that, right, there's like falsehood, which we would usually think of as like inaccurate representations or something like that. But I guess, when we're talking about nothingness, we approach a much more salient question of is things that like aren't logically coherent or things that are false, say, is that an actual ontological aspect of reality, or is that just a part of subjectivity? Or yeah.
I think I've got something to jump up from that. So for me, nothingness is the space, or actually, it's so hard to talk about it because of the nature of it. It sort of defies being captured by language. But I think of both existence and non-existence being equally valid. Almost like if you think of like the number line in mathematics, like you have positive and negative numbers, and both are like equally valid numbers. And so nothing to me is that boundary between existence and non-existence. Or so I guess on that number line, it would be zero. Like it doesn't have a value. It's like the absence of a value, but it creates a border between two things or two sets of things. Or it is the boundary. Like the boundary doesn't exist, but that's kind of the essence of nothing, right? It's like the absence of the thing. Like you have neither the thing nor you're not missing the thing either. It's just like there's no reference at all. So I think that's probably how I would describe my conception of nothing.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's very close. I think that there is an issue there as well, but yeah, for all intents and purposes, we see things the same way. I think there's an important bifurcation to make, and it's nothingness as it relates to the physical world, and then nothingness as it relates to the ground or the fundamental reality. In mirology, the study of wholeness and its parts. So on the whole, to me, that would represent the ultimate reality, or I don't necessarily think falsehood is any kind of a relevant concept, because concepts don't even apply to ultimate reality. So it's just so fundamental and so abstract that it removes itself from all contexts wherein logic plays a role, wherein true and false plays a role. It's that transcendental or pervasive. So anything that points to that, we usually can use zero or nothingness or void as equivalent terms to point to that, which I just talked about. I actually have two books here about that. You have like Parmenides and the Way of Truth, and you have Zero, a biography of Dangerous Idea by Charles Zeif. Fantastic book. I'm not sure if you guys read it, but there's an important delineation. I think that we keep talking past each other in general as a topic in philosophy. And we don't make that distinction between, discussing the world of physics and then discussing the world of abstracts, and like trying to understand how they coexist. Because, for example, if we go with InSync's data logic, at what point does information or data interface with quarks, which is the most fundamental building block that we found in our physics? Like, how does information translate into that? Is a certain quark like charm the basic unit of data? Is it the first, is it the number one? These questions, that's where I'm interested at understanding boundaries. So as you said, Nano, nothingness, the way you put it, I think is a little bit erroneous, but I understand that the mechanism is necessary, that nothingness is the boundary between non-existence and existence. I say something extremely similar, but we use that as a conceptualization for our relativistic world where there are differentiations. Because nothingness doesn't exist to begin with, and that's the problem. It cannot separate existence and non-existence. And so the two do not function with each other in a physical way. But we have to we necessarily require physical examples to try to make sense of this. So if we want to stay rigorous to the logic, but insofar as it behaves, absolutely, it is a boundary. It is a sort of a separation or a container. It's just that, you know, in and of itself, it does not exist. So that void, that non-existence, it cannot interact with existence, and yet it bounds it together, which is really, really strange. So, I don't really have a gripe against what you said. I just think that it's important to clarify what we mean by using zero or nothingness as a boundary. Would you agree?
So one important caveat I would say is I wouldn't just go say that nothingness does not exist. I think it's also important to mention that it doesn't not exist either.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah.
It exists, but what does it mean when you say it exists? I'm just trying to say is we have to remove physics from it.
So from the perspective of non-existence, you can say that nothing exists, and from the perspective of existence, you would say that it doesn't exist, because it's similar to that the paradox thing again, right? Like with the lies paradox, if you from the perspective of the statement being true, then your result is false. From the perspective of being false, your statement is true. It's like that same.
Yeah, I agree with that.
It's almost as if the like that example of the lies paradox is like you getting stuck crossing that boundary over and over again, back and forth, as you try and, because it's like the lies paradox is pointing to the boundary, and so whenever you follow that pointer, you just end up on the opposite side of it, and you never actually arrive at it.
That's okay. That's the perfect segue into what I was saying before, that from the perspective of void or nothingness, it is true. And so that's why I say that that's a matter of experience, that no matter how much you use language or physical examples or logic, the Godhead, there is no Godhead, in other words, that can truly put a finger on it, because that's the whole point. It is nothing that you can put a finger on. It's something to be experienced. So, and that's where I think InSync and Alexander's work, they make a great job of creating a ladder that can lead one to that experience, and to play around and to go back and forth from one side of the boundary to the other until you get that understanding as a matter of integration of experience versus just an ability to verbalize it or conceptualize it.
Yeah, I think of like trying to find and understand that boundary, sort of like equivalent to trying to like find shadows using a torch or a flashlight. Like if you try and point it at it, then it ends up gone. But like you can still understand it by the way that it changes, and you can sort of see, at least if it's a sharp lens, you can see the boundary between the light and everything around it. And so I think that trying to capture it with language is like trying to capture a shadow using a light source.
Yeah, well, the light source creates the shadow, and it would, to me, I would say it's like trying to remove the light source and still keep the shadow. Well, the shadow can't exist without the light source, And this is why I think there are some ways we can start to parse out methods of like thought experiments that can allow people to start understanding how not to fall into that trap. Like, for example, I came up with this experiment many years ago. I was thinking about this caveman, and how ironic it is, and irony seems to have something to of a role to play. It's interesting, but the statement that a caveman's safest bet for shelter is also the most riskiest. So, a cave, for example, he's outside of the cave and he's on his way to the cave, and his safest bet is also happens to be his most dangerous, because it's also safe for other dangerous animals, right? So before he walks in, it's both safe and unsafe. And I think that's what, it's just a very simple reductionist explanation or thought experiment that talks about quantum physics in some fashion, that you have this spectrum of possibilities, and they're all true. Now, insofar as probabilities comes in, you still have a degree of truth on both sides. Maybe it's 2% chance that there's a bear in there right now, but either way, there's still an amount of truth to it. So that's where you start to talk about space and time, because at this time and at this space outside of the cave, you have a certain amount of probability or truth values that exist, that coexist, and until you go in, you know, and confirm or collapse that result, you don't have a result that would be a law of non-contradiction or excluded middle. So, you know, if we use that kind of a very simple thought experiment to introduce space and time, you can put space and time next to the probability or possibility of zero or nothingness, I think. Because now you just supplant the idea that, okay, instead of there being a bear or not there being a bear, now we're talking about existence as a whole and whether it can coexist with void. And that's where it starts becoming way more obfuscated and confusing, because, you know, how can existence be, and next to, like, because we have the truth value of one, we are around to think about it and to exist, I think, therefore I am, right? Then by definition of logic, nothingness cannot be. But then you start to actually think about existence and myself and the boundaries of that. You know, if the universe is expanding, what is it expanding into, and from with what? Like, from within what? What is at the boundary of space and time? Is it expanding into nothingness, or is there a larger, you know, supra-spatial temporal construct? And if that is a construct, then it exists. So you have this infinite regress, and you ask yourself, well, you know, at what point is infinity inclusive of nothingness or void, and how does that work? So, like, the more you dig into the physical examples that we can come up with to try to conceptualize the relationship between void and existence, you start to realize you're getting further and further away from physics, and you're going into pure consciousness, you're going into pure experience, and that's where it's too large to encompass any kind of mechanism to reduce it, which is symbolism and language and so on. So that's a bit of a very short, kind of unsophisticated ladder that I've created, just to kind of lead people to that notion. But I think that it is possible to, let me say it this way, it is possible to conceptualize what we're discussing here to the extent that it's possible. And I think that datalogical metaphysical theory and what Alex's work does is that it does what is possible to explain what is, you know, inexplicable.
I wanted to just take a quick opportunity to, I guess, reflect back to you some of what I think I hear you guys saying, you know, because obviously some of these ideas, you know, there's some, like, I think there's a lot of value in this way of thinking, but there's also like a limit in terms of how far I personally am willing to go. And so I thought I'd, you know, take a crack at, I guess, yeah, reflecting back what I'm hearing and seeing how that lands with you guys and what you would add or take away or how you would clarify it. So kind of what I heard you say, both of you, and, you know, this kind of a summary fusing together kind of thing, but sort of strictly speaking, nothingness does not exist, but it does participate in reality as some kind of like superposition or hyper object, you know, in the sense of like the Tao of the no-thingness, right? That thing that's beyond labels and language, and something that's sort of inclusive in a way that transcends, I guess, our conceptual limitations about the world, you know, like we would normally think of, I guess. So sort of, and this is what I mean when I say sort of strictly speaking, nothingness doesn't exist, because what I understand that bit to mean is like, you know, according to like our concept of existence, nothingness just doesn't, it's just not, you know, it's not a fit there. It just doesn't, you know. But then there's also some sense in which you guys have found that, well, nothingness actually does play a role in reality, but that role is in some sense meta existence or beyond existence, you know, and serving as some kind of context or that's why I use the term hyperobject or superposition also comes to mind in that, it's like this thing that, I don't know, integrates the opposites, there's some sense of continual integration of opposites until you get some sublime ultimate union thing that also includes everything that doesn't exist or something like that. So yeah, does that rhyme with your conception? Or
that resonates a lot. Like what you just said is precisely how I would word it, because like I'm gonna let Nano react to it first. I have to digest it a little bit more.
Yeah. I think I would. It's so hard to clearly articulate what I think, but I think you're definitely along the right track in terms of digesting what we've been saying. For me, I would say that it's almost as if the existence can exist because of that boundary or void. Like without that distinction between existence and non-existence, like existence itself would be like meaningless. Like both. It's also the other part that makes it so tricky is that when you're trying to talk about this line between like these concepts, it's very difficult to not end up with artifacts in the mapping process that like as a result of just how we map our environment with language. And so like when we often talk about like things like being meaningful and stuff, it is commonly referring to that mapping between like the language that we have and the language parts of our brain and the experiences. Like, and so I've really struggled to clearly articulate it without introducing a bunch of those artifacts of just that are just a result of trying to use language to describe the thing that makes language possible. And so
a gesture towards the ineffable.
And so one way that I've tried to go about it is like if I was to like if someone was to ask me like if there is such a thing as like a god or a creator, I think the only sort of half satisfying answer I could give would be that I think that this boundary between existence and non-existence allows existence to exist and non-existence to not exist. And so in some sense, like you could say that like that nothingness, that boundary or void is, I guess, filling that role that one would typically put like a creator or god in. I wouldn't go as far as to saying that I believe in a god, but if I had to try and describe what I think one would be, I would point at the thing that I can't point at. And so like, I think that boundary allows existence to exist. And in that sense, it is similar to some kind of, not creator, but like, I don't know how to, I'm losing my train of thought.
Yeah. I can maybe step in there insofar as bringing God into the discussion. I think that the God archetype is a very useful one. So however you define God to be, an all-powerful force or, a personal consciousness that is aware and has intention. This I don't think is quite relevant or necessary to bring into this conversation at the moment, for the purposes of, understanding the metaphysics at play here. But it is important insofar as it's a pattern that I've realized occurs within this kind of community. I've noticed it in myself in the book that I wrote, but I also noticed it in you, Matthew, in your paper, and a lot of the people who touch on these, on metaphysics, that there is this need to place yourself, and you're not even doing it consciously, but there is this need to place yourself as the Godhead in order to understand or encapsulate reality, to understand how it works, or to be able to say something about it in the ways that we're talking about nothingness and existence and so on. So some people get stuck at that Godhead because it's like radical solipsism. And when you get stuck at that Godhead, it can be bad for your personal life, obviously, because then you have no more capability to separate yourself or include yourself in the reality that you're saying or that you're seeing. So God, I think, can be justified insofar as we have an experience of us creating in one way or another. Whether you say that I create a house using my two hands with some wood, or I'm creating an idea that can be applied in the universe, like some mathematical equation that allows me to send a rocket to Mars or something, that creation does exist. It is an intrinsically important part of consciousness and how it exists. And if you equivocate that to a global consciousness that transcends or encompasses all of human consciousness and animal life and so on, then you can take the Berkeleyan view that God exists and that does have intention and awareness and so on. So you see what I mean? If you create an equivocation between human life and human consciousness existing in the world, then you can say that God does exist. It's just a matter of semantics at that point. But do you see what I mean? Where I'm going with that?
Yeah, it used to remind me of where I was originally going with why I brought the God thing into it, which was to say that like it's sort of another linguistic device I use to point at that boundary of existence and non-existence, and because I can then use that linguistic device to say that the non-existence of that God or that boundary sort of allows existence to exist.
Yes. That's exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this same idea I've heard you say a few times in the past 10 minutes, Nano, and I wanted to, again, offer like a reflection of what I hear you saying, which is, and I think this line of reasoning makes quite a bit of sense. So, but I heard you saying existence only has a definite meaning in the first place because of non-existence, in that if it weren't for non-existence for existence to be different from, then existence in some sense couldn't be there at all, or something like that. Is that along the right lines, or how would you?
Yeah, so it's sort of like anything, the way that the things on either side of that boundary or line are sort of defined, and this is why it gets confusing with the linguistic thing, because we have the definitions of words, and then we have the things that we're trying to point to with those words. But the way that those things are defined are relative to all of the other pieces that we're mapping. So like existence is like all of the things that don't not exist. And in the same sense, like non-existence is all of the non-things that don't exist. Like it's like a very like a thing is defined by all of the things it is not, essentially. And so like without the and even like that's where it gets also confusing with like a thing itself, like the word thing, then when you like you have to start like talking about non-things, but the way that we conceptualize of things is that basically all things are things, but even the non-things, because our language is only designed for working with things, well, we refer to the non-things as if they're things, and it just breaks down.
Well, actually, this brings to my mind, and I'm curious actually whether Nano or you, James, have ever read much Derrida. Because this concept of things being defined by all the things that they're not, or the ways in which they're different from other things. That's central to Derrida's project. And not only that, but it occurs to me that another big part of his project is also very in line with some of the sentiments I've heard both of you express so far in this conversation, namely that what Derrida is chiefly concerned with is the margins of thought, namely the things that everybody just kind of just says, okay, we're just going to assume this to make the problem easier to work with, basically, and look how far we get when we do this, and there's this whole sense of being vindicated in your initial assumptions. But Derrida's focus is, okay, but what about those things we excluded, though? Like those things deserve a look too. And that, there's a sense in which, the entire history of philosophy is this sort of organization of the systematic exclusion of certain things, certain ideas, certain issues, because unless we exclude those things, unless we put those off and marginalize them, we can't make sense of the world, basically.
Yeah, there's even that sort of things being defined by all of the things which they are not also sort of fits in with the way that logic behaves in, well, like if you think about like the contraposited, or like specifically, like I think a good example of it is the Raven paradox, where like if you say like all ravens are black, well, if you were, you could then, the contrapositive of that statement would be, if it's not black, then it's not a raven. And so like the reason it's called the Raven's paradox is because it makes it seem like you can infer like some truth about ravens by observing non-ravens. And I think that actually does hold. I think that each of the non-ravens that you are observing that are like not black are some sort of very microscopic evidence towards that original statement. Like if you were able to observe every single non-black thing and none of them were ravens, well, you've kind of proved that like all ravens are black. And so like in that case, it sort of fits in with that same theme of that thing being defined by everything it's not.
Yeah, that's the apophatic method. Yeah. See, there's something important though. I think that the reason we get bogged down or it becomes very difficult to understand is because we cling to duality sometimes, or anything has to do with the apophatic as well has its own limits. It gets you a little bit closer to understanding it. But
we had some technical difficulties in our last recording, but we're back and fresh, and we're basically just going to continue right where we left off. So yeah, over to you, James.
Yeah, so I was discussing that potentially we should look into using a tertiary solution for the duality at play here, like talking about existence, non-existence. There are some issues that we run into doing that, because how can you define one when the other is a pure negation of the other? So having like there's a philosopher named Florentine Smarandacci. I think he might interest you, Nano. He came up with this. He actually came up with the term paradoxism in the 80s in Romania, and he's kind of obscure now, but he has his own thing that he calls Neutrosophy, and he's derived lots of different kind of mathematical models and things like that. But essentially, it's positive, negative, and zero or neutral. So always having that third component that synthesizes both positive and negative, which is, I think, just reflective of religions anyway. You look at the Trimurti in Hinduism or the Trinity in Christianity, this idea of three, having that third aspect is really what I think we're doing as well. There's nothing new. But that being said, I'm curious, everything you've described, Nano, is very much in line with what I intuit about the world as well. So if there was a third aspect or a synthesis, like how would you synthesize existence and non-existence as just one thing?
I'm not sure I'm understanding the question. So
how would you describe reality, basically, um, as a synthesis of both void and existence?
not too sure. I have to think about it a bit more.
It's difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to get back
pretty much more.
back at where we were at yesterday.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a big and complicated question to answer, especially if you put on the spot.
It's true. I'll be honest. Yeah, I'm. It is like the question that I have in general. So I don't mind you not coming up with an answer right away. I mean, to articulate it, to verbalize it succinctly on the spot is the whole challenge that we're talking about. So I'm okay that if we can revisit that personally, but that is what I want to know from you. Like, how would you synthesize the two?
I do sort of see it as like existence and non-existence as two parts that make up a whole. And it's sort of like that kind of more than a sum of its parts kind of thing. I'm just not sure how to articulate it. Like, it's like this weird boundary that the things are sort of like connected but also distinct. Like they're related, but they don't directly interact in any way. Yeah, I'm not too sure how to describe it further.
Yeah, I don't even know. Like, that's the thing. As soon as we bring in words like interact and that they're two parts of a whole, like that's what starts to obfuscate things, and we start to try to understand what is the relationship between these things, if they can be mutually exclusive, or if they interact or don't interact, and how do they exist separately, and all these kinds of questions. But I think that's precisely like where we're at. That's the boundaries of our thinking at the moment, which is what I would like to work on with someone like you, to try to maybe clear that up. Yeah.
My sense of where the two of you were meeting last time, it sounded almost like the nothingness was emergent, or it was called in by existence. Like it's not something that can be just there by itself and then existence pops into existence afterwards. It's like they're co-arising in some way. And I think even Nanoscholar, you used a simple analogy before as like the number line. Like the zero is kind of like the balancing point of negative to infinity and positive to infinity. And if negative and positive on the number lines, they balance each other out. It's not like the zero is its own entity, but it kind of is. It's like it's emergent, but it's not. It's more like a boundary, or it's more like the culmination of those two things in balance is a zero or a void.
I'm curious. I know yesterday we talked a lot about, I guess, somethingness and nothingness being dependent on one another, which brought to mind, well, when Alexander was just saying about them being co-arising. There's a notion in the East it's called interdependent origination. And the idea is sort of that, the opposites call each other forth. It's like you don't have black and then white, or white and then black. Black and white, in some sense, necessitate one another, something like that. But I guess I'm still a little puzzled around this idea of, I guess, you have somethingness and you have nothingness. And I kind of understand the idea that you can't have one without the other, or that one receives its identity by being different from the other, or something like that. But I'm a little confused on the talk of a boundary, because it seems like this boundary is like at once being conceived of as, I guess, the crossing over point from one opposite to the other. But then also it seems in some parts of the discussion that it almost seems like the boundary is its own independent entity, something over and above or separate to somethingness and nothingness. And I guess maybe this would be helpful, because I have obviously my own commitments about the nature of nothingness, and how much it can be involved in an ontological discourse. And it kind of reminds me of a saying. It's funny because I actually came up with this when Chris and I were originally working on DM theory. I was very impressed with it, and only come to find out later on that actually it's got a long history. That it's a famous ancient saying of a geometer, unknown geometer. But the saying is, existence is a sphere whose center is everywhere and whose boundary is nowhere, basically. And I guess that's more how I would relate to this notion of a boundary of nothingness is, nothingness in the sense of being a limiting factor of existence is precisely the kind of boundary that doesn't exist anywhere because, it's not the kind of thing that can partake of existence. And so, you're looking for this boundary, but it's not in any sense, it's not really there. But and then there's that other half of it in which, in some sense it has to be there in order to give an identity to the thing, but it's never actually manifest anywhere ever. I don't know. Yeah, I guess I'm just.
Can I respond to that before you, Nano? Just because I have some thoughts there. Yeah. So it's because you first mentioned what was it? Interrelational.
Interdependent origination.
That's right. Okay. So that sounds to me like a contingency, right? That they depend on each other. But then you said something that they call each other forward, which is a different thing. And I think it is important to make the distinction that in my worldview, I don't see existence and void being contingent upon each other. I see them more like they call each other forward. So I think then it would be important to introduce the idea of an antinomy, which is the specific type of paradox that's at play here, that they can't exist without. So being contingent has this idea of dependence, meaning that you're starting to call forward precedents, like one happens over the other or one justifies the other in a discrete way, which then, we can see how that devolves into this issue of boundaries and trying to understand, well, what is the boundary and how can it be there and all these things. So I think that once we understand that there isn't one that precedes the other, that's already you're introducing space and time, which you're just talking about existence at that point. So you cannot talk about precedence, you cannot talk about contingency. And again, this is why I like to use the word antinomy, is that one thing can only exist through its own negation. So that really starts to show how the two are made one. So a little bit more closer to the idea that void is something that that can be encapsulated within this idea that negation or something exists through its own negation. That's the closest bound thing or object that's possible. So where the boundary comes in is the human mind, like where human consciousness is capable of arriving at that idea, which is the infinity limited idea that I discuss. That the real boundary is just the paradox that we experience in our consciousness when we think about void and the relationship between void and existence. Does that have any kind of clarification effects, or does it confuse things more?
Yeah, I mean, I know from our previous talk a little bit about what you're talking about when you say infinity limited, but I don't think Nano would be familiar. Maybe you could just elaborate a little bit so he has a bit of a better grasp on what you're connecting to there.
To encapsulate it, I try to understand the relationship between perception and conception, because I think that perception is within the realm of the physical, right? So our senses channel information from the external world, and that's limited. Conception is that which consciousness does, which is able to bundle together many perceptions and attach a symbol to it, giving us meaning, and then it allows us to operate in the world. So if we have a concept such as infinity or nothingness or any of these abstractions that are, irreducible to something effable, like, you can't really make it tangible or scientifically deduce it, then what does that mean? At that point, you realize, okay, well, under the rules of logic that does apply to the physical world, if there is an element to it that is required that we can't prove, like zero or infinities, which we use in mathematics all the time, then the true boundary is not existence as it is, having this capability to exist with void somehow, or as void at the same space and time, then the true boundary is really just the limit of my perception, so where it ends, and the beginning of my conception, where that begins. And that's where the paradox happens. You think of infinity, and it's a series of beginnings and endings that itself has no beginning and ending, and then you have this loop in your mind. That's the true boundary, and that's why I think it's important to realize that if there are veridical paradoxes out there, meaning that we have proven that some paradoxes just are, then it does give credence to the fact that an antinomical paradox and even a dialethic paradox can also be, and that's the one thing that becomes really the bedrock where you cannot go further, because how are you ever going to prove that this specific dialethia, and actually it's both an antinomy and a dialethia, two types of paradoxes together, how are you going to prove that? Well, at that point, it's no longer a matter of proof. It's a matter of pure empirical experience through consciousness, which is why I think, people who meditate and, take yahe or ayahuasca or whatever, they kind of sense it intuitively, but, we'll never be able to prove it scientifically. Does that give I'm just sort of condensing everything.
Yeah, I think I'm following. There was one thing that I wanted to respond to that Instinct said also, which was sort of the impression I was getting based on what you were describing, Instinct, is that you're sort of conceiving of that void or nothingness as like that which is outside of existence, whereas I think for me it's like that's not two pieces, it's three pieces. So like there is existence and the negation of existence, which is non-existence, and then between them is where void sits. That is what I mean by it. Like it is a third piece that allows the two pieces to remain distinct, although like related in the ways that were described earlier by James. And so I just lost my train of thought again.
Well, so what's that third piece, Nano? Because for me, it's consciousness, right? That boundary or that paradox in consciousness. But for you, what would you say that third piece is?
It's the piece that isn't. There is no third piece. So like maybe if you think of like having two jigsaw puzzle pieces and then you piece them together, well, there is like a dividing line between these two pieces that make up like the puzzle. Say it's a two-piece jigsaw puzzle. And so it's not a piece, but it's still there, but it's not part of the puzzle, if you know what I mean. Like that's sort of how I conceive of it. It's almost like a reference point rather than an actual thing. If I'm not sure how to describe it better than that. Like it's not a piece of the puzzle, basically.
I guess I'm a little bit puzzled by your way of characterizing it, because at least I think with James's suggestion, I can kind of make sense of the idea that like cognition or consciousness is like a common context within which these two things are kind of like, I don't know, brought together or unified. But with the idea of what you just, I kind of can grasp what you're gesturing towards. The dividing line is the thing you're trying to designate. But the thing is that obviously, usually with a puzzle, that dividing line has been put there on purpose to make it a puzzle. So, and that's the bit I'm kind of having a bit of difficulty with, is if we take away this notion of, okay, someone's gone and put that dividing line there, right? Like the dividing line is somehow like a projection onto the world of consciousness, which is really what we're talking about in the case of a puzzle, right? It starts out as a whole picture. Consciousness imposes a cut in the picture, and then it's piecing it back together. That's what a puzzle is.
Well, it's not so much that there's a cut, it's that it's to do with the identity, how like you have existence and its negation, non-existence, and sort of them calling each other into being referenced in the discussion, I guess. Like it's not the negation itself. Like it's if you were to like try and write it out as a formula or something, it's just that when you have the thing and its opposite, there is, I don't want to say a thing that makes them distinct, but they are distinct because of this boundary that is in place.
So can I have a little bit of a trick to, I think, pull together or close the rift between the understanding of Nano and I and you. So if you look at, I like to call this the God key. Up here you have the 0-1, which is the duality, which to me represents consciousness, because like you said, it's a cut that you're making. So again, I think you definitely understand. Like, I think there's a reason why you both came together for the paper that you wrote, because you're on two sides of this coin and you understand that it fit together, but at the same time you don't understand how. So I think that this might clear up a lot of the problems that most of us have in general when we discuss these things. So you have that, which represents consciousness. Then you have this, which represents infinity. And then you have 0. So 0 can be reduced to void or nothingness. Infinity can be the world of matter, right? A sequence, cycles, that sort of thing, just discrete units, because it's one and everything else. And again, consciousness, which is both 0 and 1 that you're holding in your mind. So it depends on like which one you put at the Godhead. If this is the Godhead, you'll understand 0 and infinity as the two discrete things, the two aspects of the dual nature of reality. If you place 0 at the Godhead, then it'll be infinity and consciousness. That will be the only two things. So this would be the material reductionist view here. Most people get stuck between these two. They'll say, well, there's human beings and consciousness, and there's the physical worlds. That's material reductionism, which basically means there's nothing else but mathematics and human beings around to do it. And the third or tertiary aspect is what I'm trying to say. I think both people have to understand that a thesis and its antithesis, and the reason why consciousness is the antithesis of mathematical reality to some degree is because it understands, or it intuitively understands, that there's a 0, that there's a nothingness or a void or a boundary or whatever you want to call it. It holds both in its mind. So if you stick with just dualism without the tertiary aspect, then yeah, you'll always have these problems of contradictions. But a thesis and its own antithesis, you can generate a synthesis of the two. So this is void. You would have to accept void. So it really depends on like what your worldview is, right? If the worldview is that there's only consciousness and nothingness, which is the Buddhist view, right, or the more esoteric Taoism sort of stuff, then yeah, like the tertiary aspect is the combination of existence and nothingness, right? 0, 1, 0, 1, and you have that infinite timeline. So really, when you understand that the whole God key is a relationship that works together, instead of just fighting over which way we should look at reality, then you realize that it's all valid.
Yeah, I like the idea that you have sort of a reference point, and from that reference point you can measure the distance to the two other points, and from that you can figure out how far those points are away from each other. But you sort of, in making those measurements, you sort of have to acknowledge the fact that you're making them from a third position. Like, in order to be able to make a measurement, you can't be at the point that you're measuring.
Exactly. So you as the observer, like, it's like a meta thing, right? Like there's a separation between this very view that you're taking and yourself that's observing that. And that's an infinite regress of an infinite regress. Because then you have to ask yourself, well, who am I in relationship to this relationship of reality that I'm looking at? Am I generating that, or, And so that's where I bring in infinite regress of infinite regress in my ideas. But really, everything that I'm saying here is already echoed very well from the point of view of logic, which Matthew does eloquently in his paper, and in mathematics, which Alex does with his archeons. I mean, it's fascinating.
Do you have this diagram you just showed us? Do you have Is that a part of your writings anywhere?
No, since my writings, I've developed more stuff, and I haven't published those things yet. But so the first book is it's almost finished. It's not finished. I mean, there's a literature professor here who wants to help me rewrite it and publish it. So I'll do that. That's the Infinity Limited, and I'm working on a second one called Eternity Unbounded. So you can see how right there, just those two ideas fit together, and it's reminiscent of everything Alex talks about as well in his work. But yeah, I'll share some of this stuff. Or actually, it would be lovely in the next 6 months to talk to you guys a little bit more and work on these ideas together to help develop them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd love to see something, essay or book form, that includes the diagram you just showed us. I thought that was a very graceful way of encapsulating some of what we've been talking about in this conversation.